Professor Minkov and Professor Tarcov and anyone else who may have been involved in sponsoring this event. Thank you. And thank you also for my opportunity to participate. Socrates gets Euthyphro to agree toward the end of the dialogue that where there is awe or respect, there is also fear. And I confess that being here at this storied university for the first time in my life, being present with a very impressive group, and being confronted by two very difficult thinkers, Strauss and Plato, I'm again persuaded in practice that in my case, fear does indeed accompany awe. My remarks will focus on Strauss's lecture as published in Interpretation in fall of 1996, but first, very briefly, I'd also like to note in advance 2 points about the relationship between the notebook and the lecture, and the subject was just on the floor, so this will contribute to that. One, the notebook includes hundreds of references to particular lines in the Euthyphro, to other dialogues, and to other sources. And it not infrequently writes out in Strauss's hand Greek words that he considers to be important for the interpretation of those lines. The lecture, perhaps because it was a lecture, has no references to line numbers whatsoever, and so it is sometimes difficult to see the textual foundation for what Strauss is saying. The notebook is therefore a tremendous help in tracking down the foundation for what Strauss is saying at any particular point in the lecture. Secondly, this point was also just made a moment ago, the notebook and the lecture do not cover exactly the same terrain, and this would be a very complicated question beyond my competence. I would say the notebook looks to me to be generally more comprehensive, so it includes notes on themes that do not make their way into the lecture. But there are a few points in the lecture that I didn't notice were present in the notebook. So much by a comment on those two sources. I'd like to try to do these 3 things in my effort to introduce the lecture now. 1, I noticed that there are a lot of numbers in my remarks today. I was trying to give myself a little solidity, fixity, precision. First of all, I'd like to call attention to its clearest points. I hope in this way to avoid leaving everything in obscurity. Second, I'd like to focus on what I take to be the main puzzle of the lecture. And thirdly, either now or maybe later this afternoon, introduce 1 or 2 points that could be drawn from an essay by Christopher Bruhl on the Euthyphro. Bruhl is a student of Strauss's, and I think he picks up some of the points that Strauss makes, but looks at them quite differently, and this could be an instructive contrast. Now, it is because I find Strauss such a challenging author that I'd like to begin by saying some simple things. And I'll do this even in the form of just making them a list. So here we go. My short list of things that are clear from the lecture. 1, the setting, action, drama, or ergon of the dialogue is absolutely crucial for its interpretation. Some of these points are clear also because Strauss makes these points in other writings, and that's 1. 2, Socrates is guilty as charged of not believing in the gods of the city. 3, the movement of the Euthyphro is unusual. It begins with the most radical definition of its subject, piety, and then moves back in the direction of conventional views, whereas, according to Strauss, Socrates typically leads his interlocutors from more conventional to more radical considerations, as we see in the Republic, for example. 4, Euthyphro's implicit radicalism can be summarized like this: piety is superfluous, and so are the gods, except for the Horyphaloid, except for the many. 5, there is an irresolvable tension between divine revelation and philosophy, or, to use the language of the lecture, there is an irresolvable tension between gods on the one hand and ideas on the other, and we've seen that explained already. 6, it is possible that philosophy itself represents piety properly understood. If true piety requires that we understand the true gods, well then Socrates just may have been the most pious among all of the Athenians, for he is most likely to have recognized who the true gods really were. 7. If the ordinary tales of the gods are not true, our best understanding of the gods may be based on the example of the best human being. This is the wise man, so we should expect the gods to resemble the wise. This is what Professor Kerber refers to as Strauss's second sketch of philosophical theology. Not only are there these points that I think are very clear, but there are some questions that are very clear, familiar, and important. I list 3. 1. What got Socrates into trouble with Athens? True, he did not believe in Zeus or Athena or the rest of the pantheon, but Strauss mentions in the lecture it's easy to hide your religious views, so what caused Socrates' problem? Was it just a slip of the tongue, or was there an essential reason for the political problem that he had? 2. What was his motive in the conversation with Euthyphro? Was it benevolence or justice toward Euthyphro and his family? Was it that we should try to improve our neighbors so that we can enjoy the advantages of having better neighbors? Was it the desire to learn something? If so, what? 3. Do cities and citizens need belief in the gods? Why? Okay. The lecture thus has many crisp, illuminating moments and questions, but to list these is not to offer an interpretation. And even discussing them individually would not do justice to the puzzling moments of the lecture. One way Strauss forces us to attend to these puzzles, I think, is by writing provocative sentences we cannot overlook. I call these the zingers of the lecture, and I'll begin with 2. One might be called a methodological zinger, the other, it is about how Plato and perhaps Strauss himself write. The other takes us, I think, to what is the heart of the lecture. In an enticing and I think amusing formulation in which Strauss could be referring to himself as well as Plato, he says, quote, "No solution to the problem of piety shall be given, lest the reader be prevented from seeking the solution for himself." Thank you very much. I doubt I am alone in being disappointed to be told so bluntly that the main subject of the Euthyphro will not be settled, but one effect of the boldness of the assertion is to put this message at the forefront of our attention. So we then notice that there are other moments in the lecture that make this disappointment more palatable. For example, the lecture's beautiful last sentence says, quote, very last sentence, "Socrates used all of his powers to awaken those who can think out of the slumber of thoughtlessness. We ill follow his example if we use his authority for putting ourselves to sleep." Again, the activity of thinking and seeking is elevated above any particular conclusion. Consider also the lecture's very first paragraph, which declares in its first sentence that piety is the subject of the Euthyphro, and in the second that the dialogue nevertheless, quote, does not tell us what Plato thought about it. It is rare for a speaker to begin by announcing that he will not be telling us what we want to know. But Strauss says there is this, quote, comfort for the absence of a clear teaching. What is the comfort? It is that, quote, we must think, and that, quote, thinking itself may be said to be the most satisfying activity regardless of the character of the result. So now we have heard it in the beginning, middle, and end of the lecture. Wakefulness is what is crucial, not a specific conclusion. It is left to us to find and evaluate the reasons for a conclusion that so diminishes the importance of conclusions. The second zinger I'd like to cite, I think, is more closely connected with the substance of the lecture. I refer to this dramatic assertion which Strauss reserves for his last paragraph, his very last paragraph. Quote, "The only question that ultimately matters is whether the Bible is right or philosophy is. This assertion is arresting, partly for being so categorical. Only one question ultimately matters. It is also striking that Strauss rules out compromises. Using a metaphor I would not have expected, he says, we must not think we can both eat the cake and have it. Strauss is here open to either alternative separately, philosophy or the Bible, but he insists we can't be true to both together. So here at the end of the lecture that we never mentioned the Bible at all, we hear that the authority of the Bible is challenged by that of philosophy, and that this is a question of crucial importance, the only question of ultimate importance. It would be odd to end the lecture by stressing a question irrelevant to it, so I take it that Strauss is giving us a dramatic invitation to reconsider the lecture with the tension between the Bible and philosophy in mind. It helps us to note that even though the word philosophy never appears in the dialogue, the Euthyphro, Strauss uses it 19 times in his lecture. But can a text written in pagan times teach us anything about philosophy and its relationship to the Bible? Strauss says nothing explicitly about this theme, and as with the word Bible, this lecture never uses the word revelation. But he nevertheless seems to be thinking of the Bible in the following ways. I think, my sense is, most of you would agree with this thesis. I'm going to run through the reasons that I hold it. That is, the applicability of this discussion of the Euthyphro to considerations also in the biblical context. 1, he refers to piety as worshiping the ancestral gods according to ancestral custom, and he speaks of Socrates' unwillingness to simply accept tradition, the ancestral, and the tales believed in so enthusiastically by Euthyphro and the other Greeks. But ancestral stories about the divine were important for the Bible as well, and it is natural to think that had he been exposed to them, Socrates would have wanted to bring a critical eye to these stories as he did to the tales told of Zeus and the Olympians. 2, ancestral opinions and practices claim to be more than merely ancestral, for they are also attested by prophets who claim some sort of more than human knowledge. Euthyphro was one such prophet. And when Strauss develops Euthyphro's claims to divine wisdom, his sketch sounds as though he might intend it to apply to the prophets of a more recent tradition as well. I think Strauss considers Euthyphro's professed wisdom to represent a challenge to philosophy. Could it be true that Euthyphro has this supernatural wisdom? And I think the same is true with regard to the claims of the Bible to be a divinely revealed text. 3, if Strauss does not refer directly to the Bible in its rivalry with philosophy, he devotes his paragraphs 14 to 17, forgive me, but if you count up the paragraphs of the essay that I'm working with, there are 21. In paragraphs 14 to 17, this is the place for the intense concentration on the gods versus the ideas that Professor Kerber has already told us about. In Strauss's presentation, the question is whether the gods are prior to the ideas or vice versa, which was also a question debated in the Christian Middle Ages, though the biblical God took the place of the pagan deities, of course. If the gods are prior, which in the notebook Strauss identifies as the orthodox position, there are no ideas for the gods to know or by which to guide their actions. This is a review for you. It'll be brief. They would create freely, the gods would, but this means already blindly and without purpose. Such all-powerful gods would mean there is nothing permanent for philosophy to know. Everything would be fluid, subject to divine whim, with no fixed laws regulating change. If, on the other hand, the primary beings are not the gods, but are permanent ideas, as Euthyphro seems to grant, any gods would themselves have to take these ideas into account. They might act justly or perhaps even a little unjustly, but they could not remake the idea of justice. This radical opposition between gods and ideas suggests the mutually exclusive alternatives that, in one case, the gods are arbitrary and knowledge is impossible, In the other case, in Strauss's words, again in review, the gods become superfluous, except for the many, for they are displaced by the ideas. The qualification except for the many is explained in the 18th paragraph of the essay. It's an interesting paragraph, I think. Number 4, Strauss takes Euthyphro's first definition of piety to be that piety is imitating the gods. We've heard about this already. And he develops this idea to show that it is deeply radical. This issue is also one, the idea of piety as imitation, that is reminiscent of biblical themes. That's what I'm trying to suggest generally here. Strauss's reading grows out of Euthyphro's complaint that his family and others are criticizing him for prosecuting his father, and he counters that he is only doing what Zeus did when he punished his father. So why should anyone blame him, Euthyphro? One might have responded that the guilt of Euthyphro's father, in the case as it's presented in the text, was hardly clear. And he had certainly not gone so far as to eat his children, as Zeus's father had done. But following Socrates, Strauss leaves these details aside and looks for the general understanding implicit in Euthyphro's response. He finds that the young man's core defense is that one should imitate the gods. The gist is simple. Conventional piety teaches us to obey the gods, to choose a biblical example. If God says, do not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it is pious to obey him. Adam and Eve respond in effect, no, we want to be like the gods with our eyes open and knowing good and evil. We want to imitate God, even if this means disobeying him. In the case of the Bible, the diabolical character of this view is indicated by the serpent's role in encouraging it. And when punishment is administered, it is presented as just. On Strauss's reading, Euthyphro defends himself precisely on the grounds that he is imitating Zeus, which Strauss shows to be an impious but impressive course of action. Professor Kerber also developed this, that there was a certain limited, I would say, very limited admiration for Euthyphro on the part of Strauss, because he has this idea of the imitation of the gods. Frankly, I don't see that it goes so far as to suggest there's a potential philosopher or anything quite like that, but there's a certain something. But as Professor Kerber pointed out, Strauss also criticizes Euthyphro for lacking the courage and constancy to stay on course and stick with this idea. So it is much better in Strauss's view for Euthyphro, and in Socrates' view too, for Euthyphro to be led back in the direction of conventional piety by Socrates. Meanwhile, Strauss, even more than Socrates, I think, pauses to bring out all of the radicalism that could possibly be associated with Euthyphro's response. I think that is to say, Strauss develops this. It's not obvious to that it's there in a detectable fashion to ordinary eyes. At least in these ways, the lecture is a radical document that offers us several ways of thinking that depart from the orthodoxy that Socrates rejected at the price of his life, as well as from more recent orthodoxies. But this is only to say that Strauss helps us to see the alternatives. It is much more difficult, at least for me, to say whether he helps us to decide between them. You get clear alternatives. How do we decide? Following Plato, Strauss arranges things such that few or no one would side with Euthyphro over and against his impressive interlocutor. You read Plato, you side with Socrates. You read Strauss, you side with philosophy and Socrates. But does this mean that he has established or made progress in doing so, that Euthyphro's claim to divine wisdom is false? Is there any way to do this? To sketch a philosophical theology, which Professor Kerber did for us, and place it next to orthodox beliefs helps greatly to show the incompatibility between them. Very different. But how does it show the superiority of one or the other in understanding? As Professor Kerber said, I believe, that many of the arguments rest on hypotheses. If we don't know anything about the gods, and then we reason about to the gods from the best human qualities, then we'll conclude that the gods are like wise men. But how do we explore those ifs? I am puzzled by this feature of the lecture. It shows in several ways the superiority of philosophy, but this may not sound the way I mean it, but only to those who already accept it. For example, in asking whether piety is a virtue, Strauss asks, was Socrates pious? This is the second paragraph of the lecture. For on the premise that the philosopher is the pinnacle of all the virtues, establishing that Socrates was pious will also establish that piety is a virtue. Right. But can we start by assuming that Socrates was the pinnacle of all the virtues? That's a handy place from which to begin the argument. And when wondering how to think about the gods in the absence of clear knowledge, Strauss says the gods must be like the best human beings, that is, the wise. But if we're open to doubt about the rivalry between philosophy and the Bible, don't we need to view the superiority of human wisdom as a thesis that needs to be established, rather than a premise from which we can begin? And then there are those beautiful tributes to Socratic wakefulness and thinking that do move me, regardless of its results, thinking regardless of its results. And these pop up in the beginning, middle, and end of the lecture. They strike me as a powerful suggestion of the nobility of the philosophic quest. But can they establish the superiority of philosophy over claims of divine wisdom? And the gods are declared superfluous on the grounds that the ideas make them such. But what do we know about the ideas? To stress this last example, the notebook, this is one of the points I think is most helpful for me about the notebook. To stress this last example, the notebook makes it easier for us to question the ideas than the lecture does. It refers to them as a doctrine 4 times. I take it from the point of view of philosophy, doctrines aren't always good things. It once calls this doctrine an assumption, and it puts the word ideas, at least in one case, in scare quotes. The Strauss of the notebook also asks directly, why is Plato so certain that there are ideas? The notebook also uses the phrase class character 7 times, which doesn't appear in the lecture. Is this a strict synonym for idea, or might some things have a class character graspable by unassisted reason without there being ideas that exist on their own? Could something similar be true of intelligible necessity, which the lecture uses 6 times, all in paragraph 17? In short, Strauss helps us challenge orthodoxy, and even uses Euthyphro to help us do so. This seems like a difficult task, to use a man like Euthyphro to challenge pagan orthodoxy. Strauss doesn't. I suspect he does this in part for political reasons, to allow the case for philosophy to benefit from arguments he himself presents as in need of further investigation. Strauss delivers another zinger near the end of the lecture, which seems to me to throw into confusion one of his central points. He has said twice and prominently that the ideas show piety and the gods to be superfluous, except for the many. In his 19th paragraph, he now identifies this claim as being, that's the penultimate paragraph, as not being the truth, but only the unidentified half-truth to which he had referred in his very first paragraph. When he asks why this twice-repeated conclusion that the gods are superfluous is only a half-truth, he answers that the gods are not superfluous after all, because we know that the gods exist. So, wow, we've already heard the shocking character of this conclusion mentioned in a previous discussion. So he identifies these gods as the living gods and adds to the bold claim that they exist still another bold claim, that their existence can be demonstrated, powerful term, demonstrated by starting from the phenomena of motion, self-motion, life, and the soul. Gods do exist, and the soul of believers and passages in the laws might help us go a bit further in showing how Strauss understands these declarations, but I am content for present purposes to suggest that just as he seemed to have enjoyed showing the fool Euthyphro to be the disseminator of radical ideas, so Strauss also seems to enjoy undercutting these ideas when we least expect it. Perhaps he's trying to help us learn to love the search and not to focus prematurely on the results. I think I'll save until later any comments about the rule piece that I think makes a nice contrast with some of the points that Strauss makes.
Questions at this point?
I might have one.
And when you decide, then you can.
You asked how, you emphasized the fact that the analogy of the wise man is hypothetical, and I totally agree with you. And one of the questions you asked is, how do we explore the ifs of these arguments? And I would just sort of like to ask you, what seems like a plausible path to you to explore these ifs?
Yeah, well, this is a great mystery to me. I'm posing the question in part because I'd love to understand better how to respond to it. It is an issue that I believe comes up in the Brule essay that I'm not capable of, and it's not appropriate either to make it in any way the center of attention. But one of the features of the Brule essay is that he carefully tries to find whether there is any common ground between Euthyphro and Socrates. I mean, the basic question that I was trying to raise in my own name is how deep a threat does Euthyphro pose to Socrates' philosophical activity? And I think a quick reading of the dialogue would suggest not much at all, the man's a fool. But if you start to think about the issues a little bit more carefully, you might see that it's not that easy to establish the, let's say, solidity of a world that's intelligible to philosophy, especially if someone else is out there saying, no, I have a more than human knowledge that you don't share, and I'm sorry, I've got it, you don't.
Yeah.
And is there any way to get to the bottom of that? And so and I don't have an answer, but I do think it's a crucial question to bear in mind, lest we decide prematurely in favor of one side or the other, what Strauss calls the only question that ultimately matters. In a very general way, I would say what would be very nice to have would be some common ground that would be shared by Euthyphro and Socrates, or the philosopher and the mantis.
But I take it you don't, because we might argue that understanding God as the highest being is a good candidate for such a common ground, right?
No, I don't think, because understanding God, it depends on what you mean by understanding God. If you mean understanding God by analogy with a wise man, then Euthyphro is going to say, I'm very sorry, but I don't accept that as the best way to understand God. I think the best way to understand God is to have the experiences that I've had that are supranatural and superhuman, and you haven't had them, so I can't communicate them to you directly. I'm very sorry. Your understanding of God, of how to get to know God through analogy with the wise man, would be a wonderful solution and our best available solution if I did not exist. But here I am with my wisdom. So I think that doesn't meet the common ground kind of standard. I was struck, just to just blurt out one thing that I think is relevant from another of Strauss's writings. This is from page 177 in this book. Strauss says, faith as faith must make assertions which can be checked by unbelievers. It must be based at some point on alleged or real knowledge. Now there, in that statement, I don't claim to understand this as well as I would like, but in that statement he's saying that at some point there has to be a claim made by the believer that touches the real world, and that may be susceptible to examination, and that could lead the believer even to start to wonder about his own ideas under certain circumstances.
Can I add something to this? I think several of you, and Strauss too, have written this already, general point that isn't it striking that Plato chooses to represent the most important debates, like philosophy and revelation, or I also think of the Ion, philosophy and poetry, with these absolute boaster comic characters who can't give a serious, self-consciously serious account. It's just so striking why he does it.
And did you want to say why he does it?
Well, I think you say when somewhere.
I did give an answer. I have no idea that it's sufficient. So
Which is?
Well, I think that he does, there's a political problem on the floor also, and that is how to make the world safe for philosophy. And it can be advantageous sometimes to exaggerate that case, I suppose. But I'm struck by how probing Strauss is in examining some of the arguments that he presents. But I don't believe he can completely believe in the way that he expresses them at first blush.
And my thought is also, it is leaving open then. The issue isn't settled if you don't have a strong enough spokesperson for the opposing views. It's a way of establishing the remaining questions.
What do we make of the fact, if it is a fact, that Plato leaves it unclear at the end of the dialogue whether Socrates has dissuaded him from proceeding with the prosecution, or whether that business is already over?
Yeah.
Because doesn't that get to the question to what extent there was, as it were, traction?
Yeah. No, I think it's a wonderful question. I think it's interesting that Strauss in the lecture makes it sound as though he thinks Socrates is going to make some progress with Euthyphro, but then he has some fairly categorical statements later that in fact didn't work. Now this I think, so the question that you're posing is, I understand it, which may not be adequate, but the question is whether the failure for a better conversation rests on the impossibility of that better conversation or the limitations of the circumstances and the interlocutors. So that's
It's a sort of tantalizing ambiguity.
It's very tantalizing. I think the question of motive is also tantalizing. Just exactly what drove Socrates in this conversation. In this current part of the conversation, I'm presuming it's part of the theoretical motive to see whether he can find a way to create some self-doubt on Euthyphro's part, that he does indeed possess this defined knowledge, which is interesting. Strauss, when he takes up the possibility of a theoretical motive, he speaks very broadly, gives a sort of declension of 3 or 4 motives in paragraph 7. Benevolence, justice, make your neighbor better so that you have better neighbors, and then knowledge. And what's the knowledge? It's very broad, knowledge of human nature, but it doesn't specify what aspect of human nature is that.
Do you guys think Strauss would agree that it leans toward Socrates' practical success with Euthyphro to the extent that he's really evoked fear and shame in Euthyphro? I mean, I think it's clear that he has done so. And so I would say it leans toward, without totally.
It's the opposite kind of success. You're supposed to make him doubtful about fear and awe. If you're looking for a theoretical refutation, you're not supposed to, you're supposed to have doubts about the gods themselves, whereas he's even more, he's brought
Yeah,
back
so I'm
to the
assuming here, which I think maybe we all agree that Socrates' practical point is to, as you guys put it, bring Euthyphro back into the
Well, does that have the same function of learning?
No.
No.
It would be a victory in terms of helping Euthyphro and his family.
Yeah.
So there is a moment when Socrates basically says, well, I'm sure you won't have any problem persuading the jury, right? And so Socrates makes Euthyphro worried that he won't be able to win the case practically because he won't be able to persuade the jury. Not because he's not right, but because juries are stupid. And so Socrates puts this fear in him.
As Socrates happens to know. The stupidity of jurors.
He will
Not yet.
That's true. That's true.
You could argue that in representing the effects of fear and shame, we are learning something about piety, which has been, after all, in one model, patterned on in the relation of fear and shame.
Sorry, I wonder if we can finish the first session by
Yes, sure.
Should we not have
You want to break now?
I don't know.
That's a question. I think we have time. It's about 20 minutes or so, or
It's great.
Yeah.
I'll rush.
Okay.
No, don't need to rush. Don't need to
It's
rush.
totally up to you.
I just, maybe people want to have a quick coffee. Let's just have a quick coffee, 5 minutes, and then we'll.
All right.
Good idea.
Go along.
Speak on the issues.
Well, first let me add my voice to the chorus of thanks to our editors, Nathan Tarcov and others, who made this event possible. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I haven't been at UC for a long time. And I guess I should begin unpromisingly with an apology that I'm now the third speaker speaking about exactly the same material, so there will be some repetition. Bear with me. Anybody interested, I think, in the thought of Leo Strauss, in Plato's Socrates, and especially in the relation between theology and philosophy, revelation and reason, or as it's often called in some circles, Jerusalem and Athens, is now indebted, I think, to Hannes Kerber and Svetozar Minkov for their really impressive labors in publishing, together with a great deal of ancillary material, Leo Strauss's 1948 notes on Plato's Euthyphro. In doing so, Kerber and Minkov have made available to us what I think really is a kind of treasure that deserves to be, and I think will be, read by many people and of interest to many people. In effect, they've sort of afforded us a glimpse into Strauss's workshop, and I at least find it fascinating, and I'm indebted to them. And
I hear a butt coming.
no, there's not. In fact, having seen now the handwriting, you should get some sort of prize, which would include a free eye exam. You must have destroyed your eyesight. In my remarks today, I'm not going to do anything more than try to draw attention to some of the things that struck me just as I was reading this material for the first time, and then I'll offer a tentative suggestion as to the character of Strauss's thought about the general subject matter of the Euthyphro, which perhaps underwent a change in the decades following 1948. But I want to begin with the obligatory word of caution, or at least I regard it as obligatory. The materials that were collected here were never intended for publication by their author, and as it seems to me at least, they have to yield in the attempt to understand their author's thought to the writings that were published by the man himself. Now it's true, as I learned from our editors, one of the things I learned from our editors, is that more than once Strauss considered publishing something of the Euthyphro, maybe a revised version of the 52 lecture. But in the end, he declined to do so. So this much by way of a kind of caveat. Now, although I wasn't surprised by it, I was nonetheless struck by the great care with which Strauss read and commented on, line by line, and even word by word, the Greek text of the Euthyphro. That closeness to the text is matched, it seems to me, by the doggedness of his style. Of his analysis, excuse me. Strauss keeps returning again and again and again to the same key questions or concerns. Socrates' piety, Socrates' crime, Socrates' justice, Socrates' philanthropy. Many of the same observations appear, sometimes in slightly different forms, in the notebook, in the lecture outlines, and in the 52 lecture. You get the clear sense that Strauss is genuinely grappling with this text. We see him do it. And that repetition leads to a kind of deepening. In the way, for example, Strauss works out for himself the implications of Euthyphro's first definition of piety, which Hannes went through, and in the 6 longish summary statements that punctuate the notebook. There's also a kind of freedom of expression, it seems to me, in Strauss's private notebook. He sometimes presses lines of argument to the point of paradox and even comedy. Consider as an example of the former this, quote, "The ideas are the object of knowledge. Human knowledge is always imperfect, is always ignorance. Only a God can have perfect knowledge. Man must strive for as perfect a knowledge as possible. He must imitate the wise God. If piety equals imitation of gods, piety would be philosophy." Or, as he puts it a little later, along the same line of thought, quote, "If to do what pleases the God is piety, philosophy is piety." And as an example of the comic, or maybe as an additional example of it, there's a point that Strauss first suggests in the notebook and then develops in the lecture, and I quote, "Socrates compares Euthyphron to Proteus. Euthyphron resembles Proteus because he cannot easily be seized, but changes his position all the time. Now Socrates tries to seize Euthyphron, to force him to tell the truth. Who tried to seize Proteus in the myth? Menelaus. Socrates resembles Menelaus. What does Socrates have in common with Menelaus? Menelaus is the husband of Helen, just as Socrates is the husband of Xanthippe. This does not lead very far. Here I might note that Strauss is more alive to the comic elements in Plato, and the Euthyphro is at bottom a comedy, than are most scholars. And in the lecture he explains why the current and traditional interpretation of Plato brings out the tragic elements of the dialogues, but neglects the comic, except where it hits one in the face. Quote, many reasons can be given for this failure to see the comic in Plato. I mention only one. Modern research in Plato originated in Germany, the country without comedy.
Thank you for pointing that out.
You almost laughed at it, too.
Almost.
So I want to turn now more to the substance of Strauss's approach to the question with which the dialogue deals. It's fairly easy to see the importance for Strauss of Euthyphro's first definition of piety. This Strauss calls Euthyphro's implicit definition, because when he's asked to define it, Euthyphro fails to do so, but points out instead what he's now doing as an example of piety in action, prosecuting his own father on a charge of murder. But as Strauss brings out repeatedly, it is possible to infer from the example of piety produced by Euthyphro a formal definition of it. To repeat, piety is imitating the gods, doing as the gods do. Just as Zeus acted against the injustice of his father, so Euthyphro is acting against the injustice of his. Do as the gods do. Euthyphro's deed is outrageous, not only because he's acting against his father, a point he in effect boasts of, but also because the facts of the case are complicated, to say the least, and do not clearly implicate the father. And the most obvious action, as it were, of Euthyphro consists in this. Socrates attempts to lead Euthyphro away from this heterodox action, resting on a heterodox view of piety, toward orthodoxy in thought, and certainly in deed. This initial quasi-definition is important, first, because it amounts to a rejection of what appears to be the usual or orthodox view, according to which piety consists in obeying laws and customs, the nomoi, governing the human worship of the gods, which means, to begin with at least, the city's gods. Piety would seem to consist above all in the prescribed worship of the gods and not in the imitation of them. It's true that in developing his initial view of piety, Euthyphro has recourse to precisely, quote, the nomos, that he believes requires him to prosecute his father. And the evidence he uses to support that nomos is the fact that, quote, the human beings themselves happen to believe certain things about Zeus and the other gods. The first definition is important also because Euthyphro's concern for justice is central to it. For what the human beings turn out to believe, as does Euthyphro himself, is that Zeus is the best and most just of the gods. And it's on that ground, of course, that Euthyphro chooses to imitate him. In addition, it's because Euthyphro is certain of the injustice of his father's act that he feels compelled to act against it. Here the concern for justice is somehow prior to piety and guides piety. The justice of Zeus, father of gods and men, on one hand, and the injustice of the father of Euthyphro on the other. Now this first implicit definition is important then, both in explaining Euthyphro's very peculiar action and in itself. But I think it's probably no more important than the two subsequent definitions, to which it quickly gives way, and to which it is, of course, linked. The second and central definition, once it's been developed a bit, is that the pious is what is dear to all the gods, or that what all the gods have affection for is by that fact pious, one of these head-spinning formulations. And this leads eventually to the question for which the dialogue is probably best known. I taught this to undergraduates a little while ago, and at certain points they'd heard this question before, and the light sort of went on. Is something pious because it's loved by the gods, or do the gods love something because it's pious? As Strauss clearly and succinctly brings out, This definition, in effect, raises the question of whether there are standards or norms independent of the gods that as such elicit and guide or direct their affection, or whether there aren't any such independent standards. And in the latter case, the brute fact of the god's affection would suffice for a thing to become pious. In principle, nothing would limit what a god could love and hence render pious. As a result, anything might be made obligatory, so far as we know, for all of us who strive to be pious. The binding and killing of one's only son, for example, from whom, as has been promised, a great nation is to arise. Strauss links or identifies these independent standards with the ideas, with a capital I. The gods quarrel among themselves about what is noble, just, and good, as Euthyphro agrees they do, because they don't have knowledge of these things, but instead only conflicting opinions about them. If there is an idea of justice that renders stable knowledge of it possible, beyond the near universal conviction that justice is good and injustice bad, then knowing or wise gods would cease to quarrel about it. But this would mean in turn that the ideas are superior to the gods, and even, Strauss suggests, would replace the gods, one of his many shocking formulations, at least on the assumption that we too could know, without divine assistance, what justice is and what it demands of us. Here again, then, justice, or the knowledge of justice, and piety are linked. As for the third definition of piety, Socrates is responsible for it, although Euthyphro readily agrees to it, namely that, quote, all the just is pious. Since this definition obviously uses the word it means to define, it's as formally defective as Euthyphro's first definition. But what proves to be at stake here is, again, I think, the relation of justice to piety. Euthyphro soon agrees that justice is the broader category of which piety is but a part, as odd is a part of the category number. All odd numbers are, of course, numbers, but not all numbers are odd. Hence, everything pious is just, but not everything just are. Mundane relations among human beings, for example, not all of those things are pious. Those things are not pious. Socrates proceeds to explore the relation of gods and humans with the relation of piety to justice in mind. But that exploration is so reductive, so crude, that Euthyphro resists the entire line of argument before refusing altogether to go on and the dialogue ends. Because Socrates asks, quote, what good and benefit might our pious service bestow on gods, thereby improving the gods, as if they need improvement. And when Euthyphro himself offers the relation of slaves to masters as the proper one by which we should conceive of our relation to gods, to whom we owe honor and respect and gratitude, Socrates wonders whether, by knowing how to pray and sacrifice in a gratifying manner to them, we won't receive great goods, indeed all goods, in return. And then Socrates takes the opportunity, he grabs it with both hands, to belittle still further the relation of gods to men. Well, then it's a sort of commercial transaction between us. We scratch their backs, so they will scratch ours. Here, as I'm persuaded, Socrates conducts an experiment. He attempts to free piety entirely from its connection to justice or to moral obligation. And Euthyphro demonstrably resists such an attempt, as his annoyance bleeding into disgust makes clear. The fact of such resistance may be the most important action in the dialogue. In other words, however else he may conceive of piety, Euthyphro insists above all that it is closely linked to justice. But what's the significance of that link? Everything I've said so far anyway is meant to establish it. At one and only one point, I believe, it's in his notebook, Strauss uses the phrase natural theology. Quote, incompatibly of arcane, doing justice, with divinity, ero, natural theology. He doesn't develop the phrase, and it isn't, so far as I recall, in the lecture. So what's natural theology? As it happens, at around the same time, Strauss stated in a handful of places what he meant by that phrase. He did so most clearly, it seems to me, in the third and the last of a series of lectures entitled Progress or Return, that he delivered at the University of Chicago's Hillel House in November of '52, the same year in which he delivered his Euthyphro lecture. Strauss says the following at the beginning of the fourth section of that talk, quote, "Now there is today, I believe, still a very common view, common to the 19th and 20th century free thinkers, that modern science and historical criticism have refuted revelation. Now I would say that they have not even refuted the most fundamentalistic orthodoxy." Quote, close quote. In an effort to flesh out the arguments grounded in historical criticism in particular, Strauss adds this a little bit later on. Quote, "Historical criticism presupposes unbelief in verbal inspiration. The attack, the famous and very effective attack by science and historical criticism on revelation, is based on the dogmatic exclusion of the possibility of miracles and of verbal inspiration. I shall limit myself to miracles, because verbal inspiration is itself a miracle. Now this attack, which underlines all the scientific and historical arguments, would be defensible if we knew that miracles are impossible. Then we would indeed be able to draw all of these conclusions. But what does that mean? We would have to be in possession of either a proof of the non-existence of an omnipotent God, who alone could do miracles, or of a proof that miracles are incompatible with the nature of God. I see no alternative to that," close quote. Strauss disposes of the first possibility, that anyone has proved or could prove the non-existence of God, for the reason that such a proof would require, quote, "perfect knowledge of the whole. So, as it were, we know all the corners. There is no place for an omnipotent God." In other words, the presupposition is a completed system. We have the solution to all riddles. And then I think we may dismiss this possibility as absurd. He turns then to consider next the argument from, quote, historical criticism. And this is what he says. "The second alternative, namely, that miracles are incompatible with the nature of God, would presuppose human knowledge of the nature of God. In traditional language, natural theology. Indeed, the basis, the forgotten basis, of modern free thought is natural theology. When the decisive battles were waged not in the 19th century, but in the 18th and 17th, the attempted refutation of miracles, etc., were based on an alleged knowledge of the nature of God. Natural theology is the technical name for that." Strauss then devotes the next paragraph to sketching the argument from natural theology. That argument hinges on drawing a parallel, as Wayne has brought up, between God, understood as the most perfect being, and the most perfect human being of whom we know empirically, and that's the wise man. And just as a wise man would not do unintelligent or foolish things, so it has to be assumed that God in his perfection, too, would never do anything unintelligent or foolish. For example, quote, "Just as the wise man does not inflict infinite punishment on erring human beings, God, still more perfect, would do it even less." But Strauss is as little satisfied with this argument as he was by the alleged proof of the non-existence of God. Quote, "To this I would answer as follows. God's perfection implies that he is incomprehensible. God's ways may seem foolish to man. This does not mean that they are foolish. Natural theology would have to get rid, in other words, of God's incomprehensibility in order to refute revelation, and that it never did." In his exposition of natural theology, Strauss mentions in passing that the argument from divine perfection, deployed against revelation and the possibility of miracles, is, quote, "a long story, not only in the 17th and 18th centuries, but of course also in the Middle Ages." So I ask, does the argument from natural theology extend, then, also to the classical period, to the classical philosophers in particular, and more to the point, to Plato? And if it does, what importance ought we attach to it? In short, did Plato think that such an argument from analogy would accomplish against belief in Zeus what Spinoza and others thought it would against belief in the biblical God? And I'm inclined to answer this last question, at least, in the negative. To repeat, Strauss on one occasion here in our material connects to natural theology the view that divinity cannot commit injustice. And there are a number of places in the commentary where it is brought out. what Euthyphro thinks he knows about what the gods could do or could think, what they must approve of or condemn. We've already heard that he, together with the human beings, regards Zeus as the most just of the gods. Now, in his very helpful remarks on the notebook, which I recommend to everyone, Hannes hesitates to go quite so far as to assert the presence in it of natural theology. Instead, as we heard, he coins the phrase philosophical theology, which doesn't appear in Plato or Strauss, as Hannes acknowledges, of course. But what Hannes means by the new phrase seems to me very close indeed to natural theology. Quote, the introduction of a standard that allows one to rationally articulate or assess divine perfection independently of the traditional myths represents a crucial step toward a philosophical response to the orthodox view of the gods. Close quote. Now, a lot depends on the meaning of a response, or a step toward one. Is such a response a refutation, or on the way toward one? Hannes contends, rightly in my view, that the conclusions one would draw from the analogies between God and the wise man, characteristic of the theology in question, are hypothetical. If the argument from analogy, from that of the wise man to the god, does not, of course, establish the existence of a god, it's not meant to prove that, as Hannes puts it with admirable understatement. It's meant to explode that. That same argument, quote, does not and cannot disprove the existence of a very powerful or omnipotent being which falls short of the standards set by the wise man, close quote. But this means that, in accord with what Strauss himself indicates, natural theology fails in the only respect that matters. It leaves untouched the claim of the existence of a god or gods who far transcend any human peak. Which peak, by the way, certainly need not be conceived of in terms of the wise man, the sophos, as distinguished from, say, the priest or shaman or ascetic. But then it's not clear to me how such an argument from analogy, quote, lays the ground for the rational refusal to recognize any being as the highest or most perfect being that fails to live up to the perfection of the wise man, close quote. Now, maybe there's reason to think that in 1948, Strauss was more impressed by the line of argument characteristic of natural or philosophical theology than I'm inclined to think that he was. I hesitate, and more than hesitate, to draw firm conclusions from the notes and the point form observations that Strauss makes here and elsewhere, many of which are clearly working out possible lines of thought, sometimes quite tentatively or playfully, and not making polished arguments. That's part of what makes them fascinating. At any rate, in the 1971 preface to Natural Right and History, Strauss indicates, quote, that in the last 10 years, so from 1961 on, he's concentrated, quote, on the study of classic natural right, and in particular on Socrates. He notes that he's dealt with this subject in some books published since 1964, and in one entitled Xenophon Socrates, which is almost ready for publication. So the books in question are The City of Man, Socrates and Aristophanes, Liberalism in Ancient and Modern, a collection of essays, and then Xenophon's Socratic Discourse. As it seems to me, these books, with the possible exception of the Liberalism, these books are concerned with the philosophic life. Call it the Socratic way of life, especially in its confrontation with the city and its gods. The City of Man ends by stating, quote, the all-important question which is coeval with philosophy, although the philosophers do not frequently pronounce it, the question, quid sit Deus? In the Euthyphro notebook, by the way, Strauss on a couple of occasions asks, te est theos, the Greek equivalent of the same question. And in a letter to Gershom Scholem in 1972, Strauss says this of his two books on Xenophon. Quote, they are not the last thing I've written, but I believe they are the best, and part of it may be of interest to you. They develop at some length, if not eo nomine, what I indicated in The City and Man, page 61, regarding the difference between Socrates and the Bible. Now, it is impossible for me to sketch, never mind detail, Strauss's approach to the question, quid sit Deus, in these late and exceedingly difficult books. But I will say that I cannot find in them arguments that fall under the heading of natural theology, as Strauss himself discussed that term. To raise the question, what is a God, as any philosopher must do, need not, it seems to me, entail natural theology. Instead, these books explore the guiding opinions, which is to say, the souls, of those who, for one reason or another, reject the Socratic life, whether they do so in the name of a competing wisdom or in the name of a competing virtue. Aristophanes or Ischomachos, if you like. What evidence do such resistors to the Socratic life adduce to explain and justify their own way of life? To what fundamental experiences do they appeal? This, I suspect, is the ground on which the debate has to be engaged. Not so much the supposed qualities that gods must have, as the character of the souls human beings do have. Souls that reveal themselves, and their concern for justice in particular, through questioning and answering of a certain kind, or through what Strauss, following of course Socrates, calls dialectics. Only once, or if the philosopher has earned the right, as it were, to deny the existence of the gods, could he at that point go on, as he surely would go on, to inquire into what would then reveal themselves as the human roots of piety and its mundane uses? Among those uses, the support of law and the attempt to tame chance, which Strauss brings up again and again in the notes. But in the absence of such a right, however it is to be earned, if it is to be earned, all else, it seems to me, would seem to amount to either hypothesizing or question begging. So let me just conclude by noting that Plato, it seems to me, compensated in at least two ways for his boldness in having Socrates ask openly the very grave question, what is piety? First, he had Socrates discuss that question with a comic oddball. A fool, as Strauss repeatedly discusses him. And I think in the end he still thought he was a fool. An interesting fool, but a fool. A man whom even the anger-prone Athenians laughed at. And Plato compensates for his boldness also by omitting all discussion of two things that I suspect are essential to the Socratic dialectical approach to piety. And Ronna brought up the first. Nowhere in the Euthyphro is the word soul so much as mentioned. What Strauss here calls, quote, the decisive omission. And going together with this omission, the absence of any account of human eros, erotic desire. At one point, the only point in which it's mentioned in the Euthyphro, Socrates compares himself to a lover, following where, as a lover following the beloved wherever the beloved leads. So that what the gods love is not eros. A full and proper inquiry into piety, a Socratic inquiry, would surely have to include discussion of the human soul, together with its characteristic longings and hopes. At any rate, it was Strauss's, to my mind, remarkable statement, made in print in 1966, that, quote, the true knowledge of the souls, and hence of the soul, is the core of the cosmology, of the knowledge of the things aloft. Thanks. Right.
But was the evidence that Euthyphro is disgusted by commercial exchange?
Well, by the attempt to sever, I think the attempt to sever the connection between the two.
Well, the
And
commercial
to make it
exchange.
something. Sorry. No, go ahead.
I just maybe to finish it, because it was clear what the question. Commercial exchange is a matter of justice, and he's disgusted by that. So it seems weird to use that as evidence that he wants to keep the connection.
But he's just spoken of what we owe to the gods, which is honor, gratitude, and something else. And it's not the relation you have with the fishmonger on the corner, which is what Socrates in effect says it is. So right, you can call that justice, but it's such a low.
Commercial. Kathleen. Commercial.
Yeah, when it comes to justice, it's a kind of it's low, but it's so he doesn't like he's looking for the splendor.
Yeah, that's certainly an aspect.
Can I? Thank you. This was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So I want to make 3 points. I think it's Zarko mentioned in his introduction that according to Strauss, the difference between the ancients and the moderns somehow comes down to the question whether philosophy can refute the possibility of revelation or not. This is a rather controversial statement among some of us. For example, Catherine and Michael Zucker very famously take this as the moderns being the modern attempts at refuting revelation, Hegel and so on, as being overly ambitious, and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Xenophon being more sober and recognizing the limitations of philosophy. I think that is a grave mistake to understand it that way, and interestingly, so do you.
Yeah.
You would say the ancients have the refutation, but it has nothing to do, according to Strauss and your own reading, with natural theology, philosophical theology, the analogy of the wise men. At least in the period that he wrote the notebook, we have, Zarko and I found a note that definitively refutes both the Zuckers and a version of you. So I'll read that. For those of you who have the book, it's on page 11 in the notebook, note 13.
Let us now open our hymnal.
Modern philosophy has to admit the limitation of philosophy. It cannot maintain that cannot maintain the possibility of refuting revelation, whereas classical philosophy does not admit this limitation of philosophy. It does not, and it does maintain the possibility of refuting revelation. So we know that the Zuckers are wrong at this point, right?
And Bartlett's right.
We don't know yet. Bartlett, we have to see.
Let's not lose the main point.
Why? Question mark. Classical philosophy implies natural theology. So we know Bartlett is wrong. It does not suspend judgment on God, as the critical or positive philosophy of modern times must. Right? And then there's an important point about Kant and so on, but that's not of primary importance.
No, why don't you add that, because the progress, all this discussion of natural theology was about modern ethics.
Yes. No, that's a good point. So the critique that Strauss unfolds in Progress or Return is directed against 17th and 18th century natural theology, right? That's why I don't like using that term. My sort of day job as a scholar is being an 18th century scholar. For me, natural theology means something very different in my day job than what Strauss means or what we're discussing right now. So Strauss continues in that note. It is true modern philosophy prior to Kant, who refuted natural theology, it is true modern philosophy prior to Kant had natural theology and attacked sometimes on the basis of that natural theology revelation. But the classical concept of natural theology differs from the traditional and modern ones as follows. It consists of two parts. A, elaboration of what God means, antedates philosophy proper. Right, this is all staccato, but you can follow it. And this elaboration of what God means, antedates philosophy proper, is practically identical with fundamental reflection of philosophy. Bold statement. B, demonstration of existence of God. So Kerber might be wrong too, right? Because I hold that natural theology is not about existence. B, demonstration of existence of God as a culmination of philosophy. A, question of right life, and so on, and there's also more, you can read it for yourself. What I want to emphasize is the very last sentence of that note. For classical philosophy, the argument against revelation was the actual life of investigation, not any specific arguments which could always be questioned, right? So natural theology in the ancient understanding somehow goes back to the philosophic life. So this is just sort of to framing two more things that I want to say in response, because I think this is very interesting and for me also extremely helpful to flesh out the difference that is sort of looming. And
May I respond to that, or do you have a third point?
I have two small points. I think that the notebook shows that the challenge that revelation poses to philosophy is twofold. On the one hand, it's a theoretical challenge. It's what Wayne emphasized, right? Is there something stable to know that we can have knowledge of, or is that not the case? The way that comes up as a challenge is creation out of nothing, right? In the language of the notebook, primacy of the gods and not primacy of the ideas. Primacy of will, right? And in Christian theology, we would speak of theological voluntarism. Sort of God's will things into being, not referring back to any standards or ideas. The second one is a practical challenge, right? Is philosophy incompatible with piety? Or as Christians would say, as Christian theologians have sometimes said, is philosophical questioning and doubting in that way sinful? Strauss in the notebook shows that in response to both questions, natural theology comes into play. And I would say that we can't flesh this out right now. You also, I mean, we have to talk about this more, but I think this comes also back in the late books on Xenophon and Plato. That the argument taking the highest human perfection and the articulation of virtue into account in the attempt to refute revelation, these two challenges posed by revelation always remains crucial and important for Strauss. And that is unconnected to the question of existence, and that's my last point. Is this unsatisfying, as you suggested it is, that philosophy cannot disprove the possible existence of an extremely powerful and possibly tyrannical being? I would say yes and no, right? I mean, philosophy. What can philosophy do? I mean, I say that we can withhold our recognition of such a being as God. Is that too little? I would say that's quite something, right? I mean,
but on what ground anyone can do that? Say, I'm not going to believe in that. But the question is whether or not precisely someone who wishes to take his bearings by the human mind, by reason, has a reasoned argument to do that, and what the character of that argument would be.
Sure, but it's if I can show rationally that this being that might exist and that is very powerful and tyrannical is less wise, less rational than I myself am, or than the highest human being is, I can refuse on rational grounds.
On that point, I would just defer to what Wayne said. It seems to me that it's an exercise in begging the question, what the highest human type is. What's the philosophy? Can I respond?
Sure.
No, I know that I'm not a philosopher, but I'd like to think on my good days I'm a scholar. And being a scholar, I read your footnote. That's cited that, which is very interesting. But in a way, I wonder whether it doesn't prove my point. That to find that, you had to go to the bottom of the drawer from something which was unpublished from the late 40s or early 50s. And I could, and here we might disagree, probably do, but I could see that and raise you a Socrates and Aristophanes or a Xenophon's Socratic Discourse. In other words, something he did publish, and I just, maybe I missed it, but I don't see the arguments from natural theology as he himself discussed it. Now, you may want to redefine that term, fine, you're free to do it, but that seems to me to muddy the waters a bit when we're talking about Strauss with his emphatic statements about what it is. But I'll cut to the chase. I don't try and be as blunt as I can be. My guess is that those kind of arguments, such as you laid, have a very real power to them. And I think what you said about what he says in the notes and so on seems to be correct. I have no correction or qualm. But that I do wonder whether, and this was the tentative thesis of my paper, whether at a certain point a little later, he didn't come to have a deeper understanding of the approach to the problem and what could constitute a quote-unquote refutation. And you distinguish between the theoretical and the practical, which of course is a sensible distinction. But the fundamental question, it seems to me, for the believer and the philosopher is how ought I to live post-Boulder? What's the best, how ought one to live? And that's a question which, in a way, transcends the distinction, where it's both simultaneously. One can't divide it that way. And it seems to me that the focus on justice in particular, which I tried to sketch, is the beginning of an examination of the true common ground between the two. And it's not positing what God has to be and so on, but what the lived experience of the believer is. And if such a person is willing to engage, quote unquote, dialectically in an examination of their opinions and the experiences that rest on those opinions, or the opinions that perhaps rest on the experiences, then that would be an indication. And in the course of that conversation, the person would see that his life was based on a certain tension or contradiction. That experience, that the guiding opinions are flawed in some way, could bring about a change in the interpretation of this experience. And that seems to me a horse of a different color from the quote-unquote natural theology arguments. Then, in other words, I can put it this way, the question of how to live, if oneself does not have these experiences, the call, maybe one does, but if one doesn't, you meet a Euthyphro, and they make these impressive claims. And of course, you could have a much more impressive manifestation represented than Euthyphro. Part of the comedy. And Socrates, I think, was open to the analysis of those things, but it does become a question of evidence. And what is the evidence? And it isn't simply supernatural. Part of it is the experience of the dedication to justice and what that means. And if the philosopher has a clearer understanding of that, which understanding brings about a transformation in one's self-knowledge, then that might be a sufficient indication of what the best law is. That's somewhat abstract, I know, but
I think what you should respond with maybe afterwards. Sure. I think one or two questions from the audience. And that we have.
Well, I want to step in here because in your talk you made so many statements about Strauss which have not been now discussed that I would like to say something. There are several layers of your position and of what has to be discussed. I begin with the last one. You say the only clear refutation would be to show that a transformation in the person you discuss with and who claims to have supernatural knowledge is to be seen. This is Christopher Bohl's approach. It has been for many years. I'm very familiar with it and had many, many discussions with him about it. I think he is no longer so convinced that this is the approach. But this is not our discussion. We are not discussing now Christopher Bohl. But
well, we sort of are.
But if the thing is based on seeing the transformation of don't see it, what did you prove then, or what did you not prove? Number one. Number two, perhaps you have the wrong candidate. Perhaps you should cross-examine Luther or Calvin, and they are not available, but you have only Euthyphro or somebody else. So these are real problems. I mean, fundamental problems for this approach. I don't go into it, but this is, I just for the record, I would like to mention there are problems with this approach. Now to the other layers. You make a statement about Strauss and what he believed perhaps or thought perhaps in 48 or in 46 and later gave up. I think your statement is not correct. What Strauss did afterwards was focusing on this question, what is a god? This is the correct translation of Quichen Wu. And what he did in those 10 years you were talking about was to write City and Man, where this is a crucial question, of course, and then Socrates and Aristophanes, where he is not talking about, as you said, an Aristophanes who is not understanding these things, has different experiences, but shows that Aristophanes has a perfect understanding of these things and gives Socrates the wisest lie he could give to anybody in all his comedies, and that is, Zeus does not even exist. And why is it so wise? Because Socrates says, even if Zeus existed, I would not recognize him as a god. He may be something, he may exist, but he would not be a god. And that is exactly what Aristophanes' wisdom shows, that you have to have criteria for gods. And this is what Hannes Kerber was talking about. You have to do that. And in the next thing he wrote is Notes from Lucretius. And there he gives the answer, Strauss's answer, to this question, Quichen Wu. So it's a clear sequence, City and Man, Socrates and Aristophanes, and Lucretius brings it, so to speak, to a conclusion. So this is just about historical things. And now the main point. If we are talking about experiences, if we are talking about the best life, that's also a very dubious thing. The best life for whom? If we say there are different souls, then the best life is for these different souls, perhaps very different, right? So, okay. But if we are talking about these things, if we are talking about justice here in the Euthyphro, if we are talking about wisdom, etc., then we have to bring these things together in a reflection of the question, what is a god? So all these questions, is this god just? Is he wise? Is he something else? Have to be brought together by this question in this field. And the question of philosophic or natural theology is the question, what is a god? I mean, we ask questions, what is justice, what is piety, etc. But the comprehensive thing is, what is a god? This is why it is coeval with philosophy, though it has not been pronounced, as Strauss said, the all-important question. So we have to bring this together in the end. And this should not, so to speak, should not be forgotten. It is the place also of the self-reflection of the philosopher, how he can understand himself. And then also reflect all these questions of the experiences, of the question of superiority, inferiority, best or not best, and all these things. But that is the locus where these things come together, where you are sure that you are not only asking questions like, what is justice, what is piety, blah, 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 all these things, very important for articulating, so to speak, the question of the different human souls, of understanding the world. But what is the place to bring these things in a comprehensive reflection together is that question, quid CPUs? And in this book, in City and Man, where he has it at the end, that's the question which he will really answer in Socrates and Aristophanes and in the Lucretius essay. There he answers the question. In this book, he says, only once he translates it in the Republic chapter, there it comes up, what is a god in his own English, and there he says, this is a grave deficiency in the Republic not to have raised and to answer that question. That is what he says there. Mm-hmm. And it is a great thing that this question is answered in Socrates and Aristophanes' book. So there was a need for going to Socrates and Aristophanes, not because Aristophanes is something like a Euthyphro opposing Socrates, but because Aristophanes has a real understanding of that issue in any case, of that issue, and he gives Socrates, as Strauss says, the greatest wisdom. Right? So this is a spirited but short response to your question.
If you want to have a short time, we still have one more speaker. We still have Professor Berger waiting. If you want
well, I'd like to say, first of all, I'm delighted that I roused you from your slumber, so I'm pleased about that. Your parents' slumber. I thought I might. I mean, there's so much in there we could. Your last point about the centrality of the question of Quid Deus, so far from disagreeing with that, I mean, I quoted it to that effect. So I agree. I mean, it's one way, I suppose, to put the question of nature, physis, and whether there is such a thing, which is the fundamental study of the philosopher. To go back to the beginning, and I don't want to take a bunch of time, and we have another speaker. I'm aware of the fact, which you pointed out to me, that the general line of argument or the examination has many difficulties. I'm aware of some of them, let's say that. It's not news to me. And much depends, you're quite right, on the nature of the interlocutor whom you happen to encounter. And a conversion in some cases might be possible. In others, surely, in many others, perhaps it would not be. But if you could explain to yourself, or to give an account to yourself of why, or particular points of reference, or resistance, as also in the case of Euthyphro, most obviously, that would be helpful and informative. And it's true that you might not live in a time of Luther and the others, which would be a shame. Although to some extent we have. I mean, if you want to know the adequacy of one's own position, there is, of course, now we can access them to some extent through books. But I'm struck by the fact that Socrates, if it's a fact, how open he was, even at the very end of his life, to going over these things again. There's a kind of a willingness to revisit older questions. That doesn't mean that he didn't think he had an adequate basis for his life. I think he probably did, but it's compatible with that, given its somewhat tentative character, so that the word or the term refutation would have to be nuanced, what the character of that position or argument is. I don't deny for a moment that, let's call it political philosophy, is not the whole of philosophy. But I wonder whether, in what you stated at least, it doesn't underplay too much the role of political philosophy.
Well, this is political philosophy. I was talking about nothing else. That is political philosophy.
Well, I think we'll probably have more time for this, and we certainly will make time. Now,
Plato says twice and thrice the beautiful things. I was worried that I'd have to be the fifth one to repeat everything, but actually I'm going back to the Euthyphro, so I'm not repeating yours.
And you're sitting or standing, because that's one of the examples of chance, whether one will sit or stand, or will never know. He gives that example. The chair might break.
Okay, since I can't do what Thomas does with PowerPoint stuff, but I realize not everybody in the room is as immersed in the dialogue and in Strauss's material